And I'm trying to use the platform I've got now to raise awareness about what's going on, because it's not just in mental health care, it's across, well, as you alluded to earlier, the whole of society.
It absolutely is, and really troubles me, especially when you see it. And you've been very vocal about this as well. The indoctrination that's occurring in schools and in other areas like the NHS and stuff like that at the moment. And obviously, gender ideology is one part of that. There's other things which you've talked about as well, like anti-racism and all things like that, which I think many people, when you use the terms like gender ideology, anti-racism, these kinds of terms, I think a lot of people, and it was myself was very similar for a while, don't really know what is being communicated when people use these terms, because it's almost like they're designed to be deliberately hard to get to the heart of. Because when you hear something like anti-racism, you just think against racism is what most people, I think, would think of. But or increasingly, when you're looking at things like critical race theory, that's not really how it's manifesting. It's manifesting more as like a reverse discrimination is how it's manifesting. So for those who may not be aware of like what or how you may view like gender ideology as a whole, if somebody asked you what is gender ideology, what would your answer be if you wouldn't mind me asking that?
uh, well, the kind of sassy part of myself wants to say that it's a blight on society, but in terms of what it encapsulates, it's this relatively recent narrative that everyone has got this innate gender identity that can be aligned, but in many cases is not aligned with the sex that you have been assigned at birth, something that has been given to you by a doctor or by your parents. Um, and that the way to be decent human beings is to allow people to explore their gender identity, of which there are potentially hundreds or even thousands of different types of gender identity you can have, and then allow people the opportunity to present and live their lives in accordance with that identity. And that includes transitioning to become that new identity. And that can range from social transitioning, names, pronouns, and such like, to medical transitioning, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, sex reassignment surgery. I think that's really it in a nutshell. But crucially, the ideology posits that we all have a gender identity. And that includes you and I. Um,
Mm,
I've been told many times when I've spoken to some of these activists online, I've said, well, I don't believe in this gender ideology stuff. And they tell me, well, you do have an identity, gender identity, whether or not you like it. So it's not up for debate as far as they are concerned.
mm. It sounds, and again, the themes keep coming back out to me. As soon as they say things like that, it sounds a lot like people who are very religious and they say, "Oh, these things exist whether you believe they happen or not." And again, that's where I see a lot of people talking about it. It's almost now gotten to the point where it's a religious philosophy almost, and they have these dogmas, as in like you have gender identity. And I think one of the fundamental concepts within it is basically the idea that men and women are completely interchangeable. There's a lot of these people will say there's no inherent differences between men and women, and that's how they can justify like men going into women's sports under the guise of having this gender identity and stuff like that. I think it'd be correct in saying that a lot of these people, however, that have been caught up in this, because I know it's easy to, when people are saying these things that can very easily be mocked, and you can mock them in particular. A lot of these people that are saying this, when they're getting caught up in this, they are like suffering in a way, because it would be distinct from something like gender dysphoria. Is that correct?
Well, the proponents of gender ideology, gender identity theory, I mean, they very much view this as simply any other form of someone's identity. They do not want it pathologized, although that
Mm.
doesn't make much sense because they're specifically asking for medication and surgery. But nonetheless, they suggest that this is just a normal part of human identity. Um, what myself and many of my colleagues are saying is that no, this is a mental health condition. There is a kind of extreme discomfort in one's body, often a hatred towards parts of oneself. It embodies forms of kind of delusional thinking that aren't based in reality, such that it's possible to be born in the wrong body, which of course it isn't. Um, so there's been a bit of a push and pull, and there's been attempts, including by some of the international organizations that kind of govern mental health care, to essentially dilute the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, again, and try and make it more like an identity. But I've always been very firm about this. This is a mental health condition. Now, that doesn't mean everyone and every child who is saying they're trans is necessarily suffering from a mental health condition. There is also an element of kind of contagion about this, almost like it's a bit of a fad or a trend. And I think a lot of kids are going along with this stuff because it's seen as kind of trendy and cool. But for those that really are willing to undergo irreversible medical transitioning, they are undoubtedly mentally unwell.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned one thing there is trendy and cool. And I know from having spoke to people, I don't have kids myself yet, but I know people in my community who have kids going through primary school and stuff like that. And they'll say there's a child in their class that's non-binary or something like this. And you only need to look one step up to the people who created that child. And I think you have another aspect of the problem as well, as when parents get caught up in stuff like this and they push it onto the child. Like you've seen how many celebrities, for example, have come out with quote unquote trans children and stuff like this. I think, who's it that came out recently? I can't remember who it was, but I think LeBron James, I think, was one of them. I don't want to obviously like libel people and stuff like that. But
No,
again, like
there's a loss. I mean, it's kind of a never-ending stride. I'm seeing it weekly now. Celebrities, kids coming out as trans, and but I've kind of suggested a few reasons for that. I mean, partly, as I say, it's because of kind of what are celebrities primed to do, and what are they priming their children to do? It's to go along with trends and fads anyway. But also, I don't use this word privilege very much, right? Because I think it's been completely abused. But
mm,
it is often those who are actually coming from the most privileged position in society that have endless amounts of time to engage in kind of navel gazing and self-obsession. And I think the children of celebrities unfortunately fall into that category because they don't have to worry about the types of things that many people do have to worry about because they've kind of got this security. They don't have to worry about money, etc. And so they have the freedom to just think about their identities all day. And that's
yeah.
part of the problem, actually. It's just too much self-obsession.
I think that harkens back as well because I know critics of Karl Marx, and this is related in the sense you had like people who have a lot of time, a lot of privilege, do a lot of navel gazing and stuff like that. And I know he was coming up with a lot of these ideas that he came up with for like Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, all of these things, while he was dining in lovely French, restaurants and stuff like that. So again, people coming from, and you are right in saying, in my opinion, that the word privilege has been either the overused or the meaning has been so distorted and politicized at the end. They've been politicized at the end of the day and harkens back to that kind of like class warfare concept almost, where it's always some kind of manifestation of bourgeoisie versus proletariat versus bourgeoisie almost. But yeah, you mentioned it was very infested in today's society. I don't want to go into too much about specifics and stuff like that, especially with the profession that you're engaged in. Do you have a lot of people bringing these, like either gender dysphoria or bringing these ideas forward in your practice, just as a general indication?
Yeah, I like uh, a big cohort that I work with are teenagers and children who identify as trans, and often it's the parents reaching out because they don't know who to turn to. Crucially, they want a therapist who's going to explore these things openly rather than just affirm them down a path of transitioning. And at times, it feels like the majority of therapists in the UK certainly adopt this affirmative approach where they just nod along and almost facilitate and enable this form of delusional thinking in their clients and patients. So I have a lot of parents kind of, in a state of desperation, reaching out to me because the therapeutic profession has been utterly captured by this. If you want to be registered with any of the main therapy bodies in this country, most of them make you sign up to this document, which essentially mandates an affirmative approach to gender identity. And this links into the conversion therapy legislation that I know you said we'd kind of come back to. But People don't know where to turn to for neutral mental health care that again doesn't have ideology in the mix. And I've heard some horror stories of therapists bringing in their own political beliefs into the therapy room, and that that has a really detrimental impact on clients, because there is a power imbalance in therapy. We can't deny that. Uh, and particularly for people who are feeling quite vulnerable or fragile in that way, to have their therapist essentially kind of almost dictating the kind of beliefs that they should have in society and suggesting that if they don't hold them, that they're immoral in some way. I mean, it's just completely unethical.
Mm. Yeah, and you mentioned it's doubly scary there when you said about how entrenched it is in a profession like yours in particular, where people are seeking it out because, at least on some, well, aside from the instance where somebody is seeking it out on their behalf, they're seeking it out because they know they need help with something. They know that they're suffering in some way, or they know they have a problem, and they've actually decided, or at least tried to take that first step of putting themselves on a better path. And to do that, they've realized the path that they're on is a horrible path to walk down in some way. They might not be able to see, further down that path where it's going to go. They might not want to think about that, but at least they've made that acknowledgement. And then they go to this person who's supposed to be in the position that is to help them. It's a little bit like me if somebody, comes to me or a personal trainer for personal training advice, and then we give them advice that's contrary to that. Is this in your profession in particular? Are we talking with regards to, people might be listening to this, they might be struggling with this themselves, for example, and not knowing where to turn to. Is this getting to the point where it is like a really serious problem? Like there's a good chance of like a therapist you reach out to could be, again, I don't want to say like like a wolf in sheep's clothing or something like that. But has it got to the point where there's a good chance that if you reach out to a therapist, you could be greeted with like this affirmative approach rather than an approach that would be just and helpful?
I wish it wasn't the case, but I do actually think it might be. Um, Actually, I think therapists have been only too willing to go along with a lot of this nonsense. It's not simply that it's been pushed on them by their superiors and they're stepping into line. I think a lot of them actually view themselves as activists in this space. And you can see it if you go onto any of the main kind of counselling directories. You can look out for the buzzwords in their profiles. There's entire categories to say things like, LGBTQ plus friendly and stuff like that. And that tends to kind of give the game away pretty early on. But both in terms of clients that I've previously seen and anecdotes I've heard elsewhere, I mean, it's not uncommon for straight white male clients to have it suggested to them by the therapist that they have white privilege. It's not uncommon for black clients to have it suggested to them by their white therapist that perhaps they're kind of eternally victims in this world. And it's not uncommon to have children who are convinced that they're in the wrong body met by a therapist who says, well, yes, that's perfectly possible. And, have you considered transitioning? So this stuff is real. And I hear the horror stories every week. And it's really terrifying because mental health care has become so big. I mean, I do also have concerns that perhaps we overstep the mark a bit in terms of pathologizing every little thing that we go through in life. And I try and practice resilience with my clients as well. I don't want to enable perpetual victimhood, but mental health care, again, is really trendy at the moment. Schools are all teaching about it, bringing in external resources and trainers to, skill them up on these things. Workplaces, all workplaces have got now mental health policies. And again, they're offering forms of mental health care to their employees. So this stuff is everywhere. And that's why it's so concerning, really. It's kind of, it's infiltrated what is meant to be a space that promotes good, reasoned thinking and balanced emotions. And it's now essentially putting the fear of God into people and I think creating victims, actually, more than anything else.
And again, with obviously your practice, I can see straight away it's very, very different because you put the note on there, the note on your website, I believe it was you actually forced the UK Council for Psychotherapy to acknowledge the valid and professional belief that children should not be irreversibly medicalized in the name of gender ideology. I believe that's from your. So that's a big win there. Obviously, are you aware? Again, no specifics or anything like that, but when you look at things like what was happening before with the Tavistock Clinic and stuff like that, we've seen it in America, we've seen it in Canada, like the ludicrous stuff where, in many instances, I believe it was in Canada or might have been in California, where the government went in and because the parents wouldn't affirm a child's identity, quote unquote, they basically stole the child away and, irreversibly medicalized them, for lack of a better term. Do you know if we are seeing any horror stories like that in the UK that you're aware of?
Well, even though the Tavistock was shut down, there are still various private clinics operating. In fact, there's an ongoing judicial review at the moment being brought by Sue Evans, who was one of the first whistleblowers from the Tavistock, and it's against an outfit called Gender Plus. And basically, the concern is the way in which they've been prescribing cross-sex hormones uh, completely unethically to children. So this stuff is still going on in that regard. But a lot of these activist charities, particularly kind of LGBT children's charities, I think very much. I mean, I've used this term, and it's a strong term, but I stand by it, which is I think they're actually grooming children. I've again been sent um, emails and message board conversations between young people and some of these organizations, let's say like Mermaids or Stonewall, and even Childline, which is a branch of the NSPCC. I mean, I've spoken out quite a bit about them. And these quote unquote charities are pushing gender ideology. They are whipping up fear, suggesting that there is some sort of vendetta against people like them and children like them in society. They are, I mean, with Mermaids, uh, and I was one of the people to blow the whistle on this originally. I mean, they were sending out breast binders to young girls behind parents' backs and colluding with these young girls on their message boards. So, this stuff is going on. It is cult-like, and the biggest travesty is that these organizations, even though even with everything we know now, still exist. I mean, there was a long-standing investigation, partly prompted by some of the whistleblowing that I did by the Charity Commission against Mermaids, and essentially they got a rap on the knuckles, and they're still running, and they're still receiving donations. And they've received public donations as well. I think to one of the National Lottery grants. So again, taxpayers' money and National Lottery players also going towards funding their mission. And children and parents are still getting in touch with them. So it's I don't really know where we go from here, because even with a Supreme Court judgment, even with the Cass review, um, these, I'm going to say, evil institutions are still causing harm to vulnerable children.
It is evil. That's the exact word that I have to find myself using for it. And you mentioned it there exactly. It is grooming behavior, because it's exactly the same way that you often see a lot of predators trying to do it. They isolate kids from their parents. They try to do things with kids, obviously behind the parents' backs, whether it's, again, you might have certain groomers supplying kids with alcohol or drugs, whatever it might be, really, really horrible things like some of the things we've seen coming out of cases in Rotherham and Oldham and places like that, where there was this, horrendous grooming taking place, obviously in a different context in that regard. And I think a lot of people don't realize is how much, as you said, they mentioned a lot of these things are taxpayer funded, is that they claim to be charities and they're taxpayer funded, is that people even would, when we're having this conversation here, people here, they still be horrified by some of the things that have happened and horrified by the ideology. They don't realize they're subsidizing it in a lot of instances. They don't realize that they're basically paying for it, which is another aspect of it that, again, in my opinion, of a wider, more sinister agenda.
Mm.
And it is doing, as you may be aware, I'm not sure if you would have dealt with anybody. Have you dealt with anybody, if you don't mind me asking? Again, only in generalities, I ask these questions, whereby you mentioned you had a cohort of teenagers, for example. Have you had people that have gone through these procedures actually, um, irreversibly medicalize themselves and then had to come to therapy after that because of the effects that it has had on their body and on their mind and stuff like that?
Well, I've worked with some adults in that space who have already gone through forms of transitioning and are now trying to, I guess, make sense of it and decide, where they go going forwards. And, so often it's not the silver bullet that they were promised it would be. Um, in terms of children that I've seen myself, not to date. Um, which, but I would say most want to. They're kind of on the precipice of it, of deciding
Mm.
whether they proceed on that basis. Now, they may be slightly hamstrung because, we've had this puberty blocker ban. However, the government has said that there's going to be a clinical trial in which unlimited numbers of children can trial puberty blockers. So, that's not great, and I'm doing what I can to try and fight back against that. But yeah, a lot of the clients that I've had since I set up my practice very much considering medical transitioning as the way forward.
And those who've come back after, actually, no, I'm not sure I'm going to ask that because I think it might go against confidentiality and stuff like that. I was going to ask just like, what are some of the general reasons that you've heard for people that went through that procedure and then come back to therapy? Are you able to speak on that, or would that be?
Yeah, I could speak in generality. I mean, I think predominantly it's because it didn't solve the problem, whatever the problem was. That's the thing about this. This isn't the thing itself. It's like symptomatic of something wider going on in a person. It's just been kind of projected onto this, and it's this notion that if you have the surgery, if you take the hormones, that will solve all your problems. And I've spoken, not in my therapy practice, but I've spoken to a number of detransitioners, people who've gone through transition and then ended up regretting it. And some of them, the regret was almost instantaneous. I mean, I remember I had a conversation with one detransitioner, and it told me that they woke up, in the hospital having had the surgery, and within the first few seconds of coming round, they felt this wave of panic that they had seriously destroyed their lives. I mean, I can't even imagine what that feels like.
Yeah, just trying to put myself in that, in that situation now. If that was me, I can just imagine being absolutely horrified. And so I see these people then. I recently went back and rewatched the documentary from Matt Walsh, the What Is a Woman one, and you see there's a gender affirming therapist on there. I believe it was Forcier. I believe her name was Michelle Forcier or something like that. But then also Marcy Bowers, the actual surgeon that was on there, just like the glee and like almost the way they talk about it when they like doing horrendous things like removing, I believe it was the youngest girl that had gone in for, I believe it was a double mastectomy, I believe it was like 16 years old, and they talk about it as if they're just saying, oh yeah, I'm going to go down the shop and get a pint of milk. It's like, honestly, it's truly horrendous. And I think the most dangerous point is how deeply it is set in other areas as well, how normalized it has become, which is going to bring me on to more of the next